Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk briefly about science fiction and fantasy gaming. I'm going to start out with a quote that I got somewhere. I don't know whether it was Quora or Twitter or somewhere else, and then comment on it. Quote, I love my science fiction gaming, but in my experience, it's always fantasy that makes for an easier game to play as far as RPGs are concerned. Why is this? Unquote. Well, it may be true of board games as well as RPGs. But I think the difference is that science fiction is the realm of more. There are lots more inventions and lots more that can happen, where fantasy can be kept fairly simple, just as medieval times compared to modern times is fairly simple. And most fantasy is based on medieval times more or less. So the science fiction rules have to be longer to cover a similar level of granularity that the fantasy would cover. Of course, we can look at the exception of Star Wars, where technology is frozen in a relatively low state. A lot of people call Star Wars science fantasy, not science fiction. Furthermore, no one expects fantasy games to be particularly realistic, whereas some people expect science fiction games to, if not be realistic, to just have a verisimilitude, good word, that isn't necessarily present in fantasy. Now, some people like it in fantasy, but a lot of people don't care. It's fantasy, anything can happen. Science fiction, if you get far enough out in science fiction, it is also, well, anything can happen. But it's organized in a way that fantasy doesn't need to be. Fantasy can have a sense of mystery, especially in the magic system itself. Whereas in science fiction, you can use black boxes and just say, well, this is able to do this, and we don't need to describe why. But nonetheless, people expect science fiction to make more sense in some ways. And because they do, the games tend to be a little more complicated and a little more difficult to understand. At least that's my take on it. I have no other explanation. Thanks for listening.